So we have been, last week began looking at the book of Job. The book of Job has been called one of the most sophisticated and mind-bending literary works in the Bible. Oh, so this should be fun. Most of the time, though, I'm not sure that people are turning to Job for its sophistication or for its mind-bendingness. We are turning to Job because we're searching for answers about suffering. And as I mentioned last Sunday, usually when we come to the book of Job, we have the big question on our mind about suffering, the question of why. Why is there suffering? Why do we suffer? Why do we suffer when it seems to come from nowhere and it's undeserved? Why do good people suffer? And those are all appropriate and understandable questions that we have. And as I said last Sunday, the truth is there is no clear-cut, one-size-fits-all answer to those questions in the book of Job. But we want to continue on. We want to continue probing and wrestling with those questions, and those are valid questions that we need to wrestle with. And at the same time, we want to walk alongside Job. And so today, as we look at chapter 2, and especially Job's friends, I want to look at a question that we might overlook when we read the book of Job. And it's not the question of why, it's the question of how. Not the question of why do we suffer, but how do we persevere in suffering? How do we show up for others in suffering? We may not understand the why. Why does suffering come? Why does unforeseen tragedy happen? Just think about how much has happened in the past year and a half. How much has been lost over the past 18 months? Who of us would have imagined all that has happened and the impact of the pandemic on our lives when it began back in, do you remember BC? Back in February, March 2020, BC before COVID? Back in February, March, we were saying, if we can just hunker down for a month or two. We don't have an answer. We don't have an answer to why when it comes to suffering and loss. But we can understand how. How can we find the strength to keep going? How can we persevere amid tragedy and loss? How do we as a community show up for others and each other when grief or loss are experienced? Sometimes we think, if we just knew why, we think there's a power in answering the question of why suffering. If I just knew why suffering happens, I would be happy, I would be satisfied. But I want to suggest to you that there is more power actually in answering the question, how? How are we going to show up for those who are suffering? And by embracing the how of suffering, we can find ways to show up. We can find ways to create space to allow those who are suffering to grieve and to mourn. And we can find ways that we can be with them and to comfort them during their ordeal. And so by embracing the how, it can keep us from answering the why question, because I really think that that's a question that God needs to answer for each of us. And I don't need to answer. I don't need to try to come up with the answer. Embracing the how, it allows us to admit that there are limitations to our knowledge as human beings, as finite creatures. Limitations to our knowledge of what God does and how God is at work in this world. And so the book of Job forces us to let go of simplistic answers that we often give out for the cause of suffering. And I mentioned this last Sunday, right? And one of the things that the book of Job really debunks is the popular understanding of suffering in Job's day and still in our day. And that is that we suffer because of something wrong that we did. It's the retribution principle. There's a connection between what we do and our reward or our punishment. And so the retribution principle says, if you're righteous, you prosper. If you're wicked, you suffer. And so if you're suffering, there's something wrong somewhere. You need to check it out. You must be a sinner. That's the retribution principle. And Job debunks that because, as we saw last week, and we will see again and again, the point is made about how Job is a righteous person, how Job has not committed any sin. And so, how does that all work out in that case? There's also a character that shows up again at the beginning of the second chapter of Job, and we met this character last week, the Satan, Hasatan. And just a reminder, as I explained last week, the Hebrew refers to a title rather than a proper name. And so we think of the Hasatan as the adversary, as the challenger. The Hasatan is like the crown prosecutor who is seeking to prove that the charge that he's making against Job is true. And what's the charge against Job? Well, the charge that Hasatan is making is that the only reason that Job worships God is because God blesses him. And if you take away his blessings, Job will turn on you just like that. And so in Job chapter 2, Hasatan escalates his efforts because Job doesn't turn right away. And so he escalates his efforts to prove that Job only worships God because God blesses him. And so he moves from Job's property and Job's children to Job himself. Remember in the first chapter, God said, you can do anything you want, but you don't touch Job. But now he's able, he comes back to God, and with the second challenge, he says, if I can touch Job, he will turn his back on you. And so he's able to afflict Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. As anyone who has struggled with chronic pain can tell us, the burden of that kind of pain is immense. And it must have been immense to Job. When you have chronic pain, it seems, as I have had people share with me, there is nothing that can distract you from it. There is no vacation that you can go on that can take away the pain. There's that constant reminder that chronic pain produces. And Job's painful sores intensifies his physical pain, but it also results in marital pain as he and his wife attempt to navigate yet another blow to their family. And there's no question that the reaction of Job's wife to his suffering is not ideal. And it certainly comes across as cold and harsh. But let's remember something here. Let's remember the kind of pain that Job's wife is bearing. The grievous, incalculable loss of 10 children. As one commentator pointed out, and I hadn't really thought about it, but that's because I'm a man. 10 children times 9 months per child. How many years just in giving birth, bearing and giving birth, has she spent. And so maybe me and you, maybe we would respond like Job's wife. We like to think that we would all be as noble as Job and respond to his wife as Job does. But let's try to understand Job's wife lashing out in her grief. She has had to bury 10 children. 10 children that she has birthed, that she has nursed, that she has raised. In ancient times, a woman, her whole identity was defined by her role as a mother. And so the loss of her children was like losing who she was losing her whole identity. And so it's hard, it's not hard to appreciate her struggle to show compassion and understanding to her husband. I think she is depleted by her grief. She's just exhausted. And it's a fact that so many marriages don't survive the loss of a child, let alone losing 10. And Job's reply shows, whatever you think about this exchange, one thing that we can take from this is that it's going to be a struggle for Job and his wife to support each other in this time of loss and sorrow, isn't it? But they cannot and will not survive this on their own. The two of them cannot bear this immense load of grief by themselves. And so in verses 11 through 13, the arrival of friends comes. And this arrival of friends provides critical support to Job and his wife, who cannot support each other in their time of grief. And these friends, as we read, and I leave the names up to you, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they come from various towns. These friends provide critical support, and they come from a distance. They come from some ways away. I'm not sure exactly where all these places are, but they're not just next door. They travel from a distance to offer their support and comfort in this time of deep need and deep sadness for Job and his wife. And they're not just sending thoughts and prayers. They're not just texting a message or sending a Facebook message. They show up. They are physically present in their consolation to someone whose pain and suffering. How bad is it? They don't even recognize Job. They hardly recognize him. And their reaction provides a picture of how devastated they are and how badly disfigured Job has become due to his grief and suffering and pain. And they began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes, and they sprinkled dust on their heads when they see their friend in pain. And what are they doing? I think they're trying to identify with him in their tears and their grief. They're trying to cry with Job. And they don't stop there. Then they sat on the ground with Job for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word because they saw how great his suffering was. This demonstration of shared grief actually continues on in contemporary Judaism. It's a practice when someone passes away. They call it sitting Shiva, Shiva is the transliteration. Shiva is from the Hebrew word for seven, and it's a 7-day period following the burial, actually. Now, I have mentioned when someone passes away, it's actually following the burial, where friends and family come and they visit those who are in mourning to give their condolences and provide comfort. It's an expression of solidarity, this picture of solidarity. 7 days, 7 nights of silence, sitting on the ground. There's a lot we can learn from that scene where Job's friends appear to do very little, but do so very much. In moments of deep grief and suffering, our friends don't need our expertise. What they need is our empathy. We live in a culture that wants the quick answers, right? We want the easy solutions. We turn to the TikTok or the YouTube videos, or we go on the explain it to me like I'm 5. Have you ever seen that expression? It's an internet abbreviation, acronym, I guess would be a better. There's all sorts of them, but one of them is ELI5. Someone asks a deep question and they put ELI5. Explain it to me like I'm 5. There's a lot of stuff where I could use that expression. And so we like the video where the expert demonstrates that solution to a problem in just 60 seconds, or they remodel and renovate the whole house in half an hour. We want to be the expert, the right words, the exact answers when we're confronted with grief or suffering. We want to shortcut the pain for our loved ones, and it's understandable. We don't want them to hurt. And we want to shorten the length of their grief. But the reality is that mourning takes time. Empathy is a long game. Empathy enters into grief and suffering, and it confronts our tendency for quick fixes and advice giving. In the space of Job's grief, where Job cannot even articulate what he's feeling. 7 days and nights of silence. He can't even speak. His friends provide the best comfort in those 7 days just by showing up and sitting in the dust on the ground with him, by providing empathy. And Job knows that he's not alone. And that may be all that Job needs to get through these first days. Christian ethicist and theologian Stanley Hauerwas says that the first moral duty of Christians who are committed to being with the sick and dying is not to come up with the answers, not to come up with the cure, but to be present. We may not be able to do much, he says, to make someone feel better, but we're not going to let them be alone. We're not going to let them be by themselves. In the biggest chunk of the book of Job, which we haven't even got to yet, I mentioned last week, the biggest chunk is in the middle, and it's dialogue. It's talking back and forth. It's Job and his friends, and we're going to watch Job and his friends, and they're going to be circling around the question of why. They're going to be constantly searching for answers to the why of suffering, and why is this happening to Job, and they go back and forth for almost 40 chapters, I guess. And The interesting thing is that when Job's friends decide to start talking rather than just sitting and being with Job, and when Job's friends question him in their search for answers, the downward spiral begins. But here in chapter 2, their silence for 7 days, may be their best moment, may be their most powerful moment of comfort and consolation. It may be these 7 days and nights of silence may be their finest hour as Job's friends. I know the question that we often have when we go to visit someone who is suffering or grieving is, I don't know what to say. What do I say? You don't need to say anything. In these verses, we see an answer to that first how question. How do we persevere in our suffering and grief? And it comes through Job's friends, who show us that we find strength and persevere in our suffering through community, through the support of friends and family, through others who, with empathy, enter into our grief and suffering and sit in the dust on the ground with us. That's how we get through. But there's a second how question that needs to be answered. How do we show up for others in their suffering and grief? How can we be like Job's friends in this chapter? How can we get past feeling like we need to have all the answers and we have to fill that silence with chatter? How can we be people of deep empathy? There's a lot of reasons why that is sometimes a challenge for us, but let me just share at least 3 common hindrances that can keep us from entering into the pain and the sorrow of others, of showing empathy, of being empathetic. First one is avoidance. Can I be present with my own grief? We might use the modern lingo. Can I own it? Someone has said, you cannot lead others into places that you refuse to go. Talked a little bit about this last week. How have we learned? Are we open to lament and grief ourselves as a church, as believers? Have you made space to work through your own grief and loss? Have you faced your own pain? If I'm not comfortable with my own grief and I can't face my own pain, it's going to be very hard to sit with someone else's sorrow, someone else's discomfort. So it may be hard for us to be empathetic, to show up for others, because we avoid the uncomfortableness of those situations, because we're uncomfortable with our own loss and pain and grief. Maybe anxiety. How do you feel about suffering? Is it something that you try to avoid? Can you let go of the fear of suffering, of your own suffering, the realization of your own pain, to be present? Sometimes it's hard to sit with someone who's suffering an unexpected or tragic loss because we carry our own anxieties, our own fears. Boy, this could happen to me. I don't want to see that. So we want, and this maybe oftentimes is what drives us to try and find an answer to the why, because we want to avoid having that tragedy happen to us. And so if I can just figure out why this is happening, then maybe I can avoid that happening to me. Or maybe it's answering. Already talked about this, but again, can you just show up, not worry about having the answers? I don't know about you, but people tend to look at ministers as the ones who are supposed to have the answers. I don't know. Can we let go of the why and embrace the how? Boy, when I have the answers, when I have the answers, boy, do I feel powerful. I can explain that to you. But you know what? Sometimes that's a way for me to avoid having to feel. Well, let me just explain. I think of Dr. Spock, Star Trek, for all you Star Trek people. He could explain. Does Dr. Spock come across as feeling? Our task in surrounding someone who is grieving or suffering is not to have the answers to the why. Our task is to embody the how. And when we provide the how, it gives the space for our loved ones to wrestle with the why. And they are the ones that need to wrestle with the why. When we carry the how for them, when we are there for them, they can go to God and they can wait to see if God answers their why. There's no standard answer we can give to the question of why. But what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount is truth. God gives comfort to those who mourn, those who grieve. It's not always according to our schedule. It's not always the answers that we want, but God does come with comfort. So if we're struggling with the question of why, if you're struggling with the question of why this morning, I encourage you to stay connected to community, to allow this church family to surround you and provide you with the how, the strength to persevere, to sit with you, the ability to show up, to sit with you in your loss and your sorrow, so that you can wait on God for some answers, so that we can pray for you. And I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. There are times when you need people to actually pray for you because you just cannot find the words. And as a community, we can pray for you. It may take years of prayer. It may take years of tears before we get the answer from God that is personal and particular to our grief and loss. And the answer that you get from God will be different from the answer that someone else gets from God for their loss, their sorrow. But know this: God does comfort. And sometimes, God gives us an answer to the why that is meaningful to us and that we can understand. There's no shortage of people who are grieving. Especially over the past 18 months, I think one of the hardest things is that our normal ways of grieving have been disrupted, have been shortchanged. There's no shortage of people enduring suffering and pain, doing it alone, in isolation, health restrictions on physical contact. So these are the questions for us when it comes to the how. What kind of friend will we be in times of grief and loss for our loved ones, for our church community? How will you show up for those people in your circle who are in need of support? How can you be the how this week? How can you give the gift of presence, even with the limitations that we're under? Maybe it will be a text. Maybe it will be a phone call. Maybe a Skype or FaceTime connection. Maybe some other creative way that you can let them know that they are seen, that they're loved, and that you are with them. You're going to sit with them for the 7 days and 7 nights. You're going to be with them for the long haul. And so what we learn from this second chapter of Job is that we need to show up for others. Show up for others in the same way that Job's friends showed up for him and his wife. In the same way that Jesus shows up for us. May we continue to grow as a church community who can grieve together, who can sit in empathy, who can enter into the space of the sorrow of others, into their space of their loss, so that healing and hope might break forth.